Okay, so this is a story about being young, making some, let's just say, questionable choices, and the science that might actually explain the whole thing. We're going to look back at a time when your confidence was just through the roof. Taking huge risks felt totally logical, and making memories was way more important than, remembering them.
I mean, that quote right there just perfectly sets the stage, doesn't it? It's a story that walks this really fine line between being brave and maybe being just a little bit unhinged. But hey, before we judge, there's a really key piece of science we got to understand first.
So here's the deal, and it's so important. The part of your brain that's supposed to hit the brakes, that's the prefrontal cortex. It's the absolute last part to fully develop. We're talking not until your mid to late 20s. But at the same time, the emotional gas pedal, it is floored. So keep that idea in your back pocket because it is the key to everything that's about to happen.
Right, so our story starts where a lot of stories start, with a boy. Our narrator just impulsively decides she's going to fly to Freeport in the Bahamas to surprise her boyfriend. Now, she already had a pretty good feeling he wasn't exactly the faithful type, but, with that teenage brain calling the shots, logic was definitely not in the driver's seat.
So for a couple of days, everything's kind of this blurry haze at the Bahama Princess Hotel. But then it was time for him to fly home, and she just wasn't ready to leave. He stuck to his plan, though, and just like that, poof, she's all alone on a tropical island that she's quickly figuring out she doesn't even really like.
She felt completely stuck. I mean, Freeport was nothing but hotels and casinos. And all she wanted was some real natural beauty. She's picturing these amazing places like Eleuthera's sapphire blue hole. She had to get off that island, and a new, way riskier plan started brewing. She gets to the airport, asks about a charter flight, and nope, nothing for 3 days. But then the person at the counter gives her some pretty unconventional advice. They basically say, just go ask a private pilot for a ride. And to her underdeveloped frontal cortex, this sounded like a perfectly brilliant idea. She was now officially a hitchhiker of the skies. So after 4 hours of waiting around with 0 flights to Eleuthera, it's looking like her luck has run out. But then a pilot who's heading to a totally different island, Bimini, the sport fishing capital of the world, offers her a seat. And she just goes, sure. And just like that, her dream of a natural paradise completely pivoted to this unplanned detour to a fisherman's island. So she gets to Bimini and she checks out the famous Complete Angler Hotel. The place Ernest Hemingway used to hang out. But a loud bar just wasn't her vibe, so she found this quiet little cottage on the beach instead. The next morning, though, that itch to do something crazy was back. So what does she do? Get this. She sees a fishing yacht out in the water and she decides the most logical thing to do is to literally swim out to it. She gets up alongside the boat and just asks the 3 guys on board, total strangers, if she can come along. And you won't believe it, they said yes and welcomed her right on board. Okay, and this is where it gets really fascinating. This is her internal risk assessment at the time. It is such a perfect window into that youthful brain. See, to her, one stranger felt like a huge risk because there are no witnesses. But 3 strangers, well, that felt safer because they'd all be witnesses to each other's behavior. It's a really strange kind of logic, but it made perfect sense to her in that moment. And you know what? Her wild gamble totally paid off. The gay was just delightful. They caught absolutely nothing, 0 fish, and they all joked that she was their bad luck charm. And when it was all over, they just went their separate ways. No drama, no weirdness, no phone numbers exchanged. Her trust in these strangers was completely rewarded. That night, she's eating cracked conch by herself when she meets this young local kid who offers to be her tour guide for $5. And apparently she completely forgot her whole safety and numbers rule because she said yes. The tour was basically just him pointing out all the places to buy ganja, but hey, it was good company on a beautiful island night. On her last full day, she just soaked it all in at Radio Beach, this quiet spot with a really cool history tied to rum runners back during Prohibition. It was a day for some quiet thinking, right before one last, very strange encounter. So for her last night, she decides to go back to the bar at the Complete Angler, and she barely even has time to sit down before a beer just appears in front of her. It was sent over by this big, burly, bearded guy sitting across the room. She gives him a polite little nod, a thank you, and gets ready to just enjoy her drink. But the bartender leans in, he can tell she has no clue what's going on, and he asks her, "Do you know who that is?" She had absolutely no idea. It turns out
She was having a drink with the star of this massively popular TV show at the time, The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams. And since she didn't really watch TV, this meant absolutely nothing to her. And this is where the whole story just comes full circle. To her, he was just some loud guy with a wedding ring who was drinking a little too much. But she found out later that he'd actually gotten married in Vegas when he and his wife were both just 17 years old. I mean, talk about another perfect example of a teenage brain making these huge, life-altering decisions. She politely excused herself and left. So, what's the big takeaway from this whole series of risky moves and lucky breaks? Well, looking back on it all, the narrator has some pretty interesting thoughts on her little adventure.
She doesn't see it as luck. Instead, she calls it good judgment of the uninhibited kind. And that's such a fascinating way to look at it, right? That maybe without the inhibitions of that fully formed prefrontal cortex, she was just able to trust her gut. And her gut turned out to be right on the money.
You know, despite everything that could have gone wrong, nothing did. And that trip became her very first taste of real, pure independence. It was one of those core experiences, you know? It created a memory that she says tasted sweeter than almost any other that came after it. Her youth was definitely not wasted. So the story wraps up with this little challenge that was going around on social media. It's like an unwasted youth checklist. It's actually a really fun way to think about the themes of this story and see how they stack up in our own lives. The whole idea is pretty simple. You give yourself 1 point for each thing on this list that you haven't done. So a lower score means you've lived a more, well, let's call it an eventful life. So take a quick look. How are you doing? Broke a bone? Bet on TV? Sung karaoke? It's a funny way to try and put a number on a life of experiences. And that really brings us to the final question for you. Whether your own adventures were fueled by an underdeveloped frontal cortex or just a deep desire to see the world, it really makes you think, doesn't it? Looking back, how would you score your own youth? Was it wasted? Or was it filled with that special kind of good judgment that maybe only comes from being completely and totally uninhibited?